Welcome to the extremely boring stories. Today we listening. The Persian Empire. Before the empire, life on the Iranian plateau. The land before the name circa 2000 to 600 BCE. Before there was an empire to remember, before stone reliefs and royal proclamations, there was land that required patience. You begin here, not with kings, but with terrain. The Iranian plateau was not welcoming in the way river valleys were. It did not flood regularly like the Nile, nor did it offer soft soil year after year. Instead, it stretched wide and uneven, high plains, salt deserts, rocky hills, and long distances between reliable water. Life here was not dramatic. It was repetitive, cautious, and slow. You would wake early, not because of ritual, but because heat later in the day made work inefficient. If you were a farmer, your success depended less on innovation and more on remembering what failed last year. Dry farming meant watching clouds, reading soil color, and storing grain for seasons that might not arrive as expected. Herding families moved carefully between grazing areas, never staying long enough to exhaust the land. Survival was quiet, and it required restraint. Villages were small and loosely organized. Houses were made of mud brick, repaired more often than rebuilt. Roofs leaked, walls cracked. There was no expectation of permanence. If a water source dried, people moved. If pasture failed, herds were reduced. Life adjusted itself downward more often than upward. You would not yet call yourself Persian. Identity was local, tied to family, clan, dialect, and terrain. Power existed, but it was close and personal. A local leader might settle disputes, organize defense, or distribute stored grain in lean months. There were no distant capitals, no standard laws across regions. Justice was negotiated, remembered, and sometimes forgotten. Trade existed, but it was cautious. Obsidian, metals, textiles, and animals moved slowly along paths worn by repetition rather than design. Traders carried not only goods, but stories, about better land, harsher winters, or strange rulers elsewhere. These stories mattered. They shaped expectations. They warned of threats long before armies appeared. You lived with uncertainty, but not chaos. Predictability came from routine rather than authority. Seasons mattered more than decrees. Work followed daylight, not clocks. Meals were simple and repetitive: grain, dairy, occasional meat. Excess was rare and temporary. Storage was survival. Around you, larger forces were already moving. To the west, Mesopotamian cities rose and fell, ruled by kings whose power depended on rivers and writing. To the north, steppe peoples moved faster than settled communities, their mobility both a threat and a model. To the east, trade routes hinted at distant civilizations you would never see. Gradually, something shifted. Groups speaking Indo-Iranian languages began settling more permanently on the plateau. They brought with them social structures that valued loyalty, oath-keeping, and shared ancestry. These were not empires. They were frameworks, ways of organizing people without walls or bureaucracy. You would notice change not through proclamation, but through habit. Seasonal movement became more structured. Grazing routes were defended. Alliances formed between groups who once avoided each other. Conflict did not disappear, but it became more predictable. Power began to stretch slightly beyond the village. Burial practices changed. Weapons were placed beside the dead. This was not romance or hero worship, it was practicality. A person's tools defined their role. Memory was functional. Ancestors mattered because they justified land claims and social rank. Religion at this stage was not rigid. Belief focused on forces rather than doctrines: fire, sky, truth, order. Moral ideas existed, but they were embedded in behavior, not scripture. To break an oath was dangerous not because of law, but because it disrupted trust in a fragile environment. You learned early that cooperation mattered more than dominance. Harsh land punished arrogance. Leaders who demanded too much lost followers. Those who distributed fairly endured. Authority was conditional. Over generations, this produced something unusual. People accustomed to obeying without being crushed, and leaders accustomed to ruling without absolute control. No one planned this. It emerged from necessity. By around the 9th to 7th centuries BCE, these communities had names: Medes, Persians, others now barely recorded. They lived under the shadow of larger powers, particularly the Assyrians, whose military brutality was legendary. You would hear stories of cities destroyed as warnings, not inspirations. Survival meant avoiding attention. Yet influence worked both ways. Assyrian administration, record-keeping, and provincial control were observed carefully. What destroyed others also demonstrated methods. You learned by watching. The Medes formed loose confederations. Not a state in the modern sense, but an agreement to resist together. Their power was uneven and fragile, but it marked a step away from isolated survival. The Persians were initially smaller, less prominent. They lived under Median dominance, contributing soldiers and tribute. This subordination mattered. It taught patience. It taught how to exist inside someone else's system without losing internal cohesion. You learned where power rested, and where it did not. Daily life continued much as before. Fields still needed tending. Herds still needed water. Children still learned by imitation, not instruction. The difference was scale. Decisions increasingly affected people beyond immediate kin. Loyalty expanded slowly outward. By the time you reached the mid-6th century BCE, nothing looked like an empire yet. There were no grand capitals, no unified law codes, no imperial ideology carved in stone. But the conditions were ready. People were used to obeying layered authority. Leaders were used to compromise. Distance no longer meant isolation. Roads existed, not engineered, but remembered. Languages overlapped. Beliefs tolerated variation. What emerged next would not arrive suddenly. It would not begin with a single battle or decree. It would grow out of habits formed long before anyone imagined ruling half the known world. Learning to live under others circa 700 to 560 BCE. After those long generations of quiet adjustment, something else happened, not an explosion of change, but a tightening. Life on the plateau did not suddenly improve, but it became more watched. Larger powers pressed closer. You began to live not only with the land, but under someone else's attention. To the west and north, the Assyrian Empire expanded with an efficiency that felt unnatural to people used to slow authority. Their armies moved deliberately, their records were precise, and their punishments were public. You would not see Assyrian soldiers often, but you would hear about them constantly. Stories arrived faster than armies. Cities flayed, leaders executed, entire populations relocated. These stories mattered because they shaped behavior before force was applied. For the peoples of the Iranian plateau, survival meant adaptation without provocation. You learned when to submit, when to resist quietly, and when to disappear into terrain that outsiders found exhausting. Mountains, narrow passes, and dry expanses were not obstacles to you, they were buffers. The Medes emerged more clearly during this period, not as rulers in the modern sense, but as organizers of shared caution. Median leaders coordinated defense, negotiated tribute, and acted as intermediaries between local communities and distant powers. You might not trust them fully, but they reduced chaos. They gave structure to fear. If you were Persian, you lived within this Median framework. This was not humiliation, it was instruction. You provided soldiers, livestock, and loyalty when demanded. In return, your internal life remained largely untouched. No one interfered with your rituals, your language, or your daily routines. Authority existed, but it stopped short of your hearth. This mattered more than it seemed. It taught you that power did not need to erase difference to function. You experienced rule without forced cultural collapse. This would later become a principle, though no one named it yet. Daily life under this layered control became more complex. Tribute had to be calculated. Grain stores were measured more carefully. Herd sizes were counted, not just remembered. This was not yet bureaucracy, but it was accounting by habit. You learned to think in obligations, not just needs. Seasonal rhythms remained dominant. Sowing and harvest did not change because an overlord existed. But the margin for error narrowed. A failed crop now affected not only your family, but your ability to meet obligations. Storage became more strategic. Risk-taking declined. Craft specialization increased quietly. If you were good at metalwork, you did more of it. If your land was poor, you traded labor instead of grain. Exchange networks widened because necessity demanded it. You knew where surplus might exist and where scarcity was likely. Religion during this time became more inward-looking. Belief systems emphasized moral order, truthfulness, and restraint. Fire rituals gained prominence, not as spectacle, but as discipline. Fire was controlled, contained, and respected, much like authority itself. To tend a flame was to practice patience. You were not thinking about empire. You were thinking about stability. The idea of expansion was foreign. Expansion meant exposure, and exposure meant risk. Then something subtle shifted within the Persian communities themselves. Leadership became more coherent. Lineages mattered more. Stories about shared ancestry grew more specific. This was not mythology in the grand sense, it was social glue. You needed reasons to trust people beyond immediate kin. Persian leaders did not rule by terror. They ruled by familiarity. You knew their families. You knew their limits. This closeness produced loyalty that was conditional but durable. When orders came, they were framed as necessity, not ambition. Military organization improved, not through innovation, but through consistency. Weapons standardized slowly. Units trained together over years. Fighting was defensive by instinct. You learned to hold ground, not chase glory. Meanwhile, the Assyrian system began to strain. Overextension, internal revolts, and the cost of constant suppression weakened their grip. You would not read this in records. You felt it through gaps, demands that arrived late, threats not followed by action, alliances that shifted unexpectedly. The Medes, sensing this weakness, coordinated more assertively. Their confederation hardened briefly into something closer to a state. They led campaigns that pushed Assyrian control back. For the first time, you experienced collective action that produced visible results. This was dangerous knowledge. It showed that power could change hands. It also showed the cost. Campaigns disrupted farming. Losses were felt locally. Victory was never clean. When the Assyrian Empire finally collapsed at the end of the 7th century BCE, there was no celebration on the plateau. Collapse meant uncertainty. The system you had learned to live under vanished. New arrangements had to be negotiated. The Medes stepped into the vacuum, but their rule was uneven. They lacked the administrative depth to replace what had fallen. Authority was asserted, but not always enforced. You lived in a space between order and autonomy. For Persians, this moment mattered deeply. You had observed empires from the inside without being responsible for them. You had learned their strengths and weaknesses without carrying their weight. Now, for the first time, the possibility of leadership appeared, not as desire, but as obligation. Within Persian leadership circles, the question was not how to conquer, but how to prevent collapse. How do you hold people together without exhausting them? How do you rule without constant violence? These were not theoretical questions. They were practical. Daily life continued, but with an undercurrent of anticipation. You sensed that existing arrangements were temporary. Loyalties were tested. Alliances were renegotiated. Nothing dramatic happened all at once. And then, quietly, a figure emerged, not as a revolutionary, but as a coordinator. Someone who understood submission, negotiation, restraint, and timing. Someone shaped entirely by this long period of living under others. You did not yet know his name would endure. You only knew that authority was beginning to move again, this time from within rather than imposed from outside. A leader who did not hurry circa 600 to 559 BCE. When Cyrus enters history, he does not arrive like a storm. There is no sudden brilliance, no sharp break from what came before. If you were alive at the time, you might not notice him at all. That is part of the point. Cyrus grew out of the world you have already been living in, a world shaped by waiting, compromise, and careful judgment. He was born into a Persian family that was noble, but not dominant. His lineage mattered, yet it did not guarantee power. You would not expect a child from this position to reshape regions. What Cyrus inherited instead was something quieter, an education in restraint. From an early age, he learned how authority worked when it was limited, negotiated, and dependent on cooperation rather than fear. Cyrus lived under Median rule. This shaped everything. The Medes were not cruel masters, but they were distant ones. They demanded loyalty and tribute, not transformation. Persian customs remained intact. This meant Cyrus grew up understanding both submission and autonomy at the same time. He learned how to obey without resentment, and how to lead without overreaching. You must imagine his early world not as a court filled with intrigue, but as a landscape of obligations. People owed things to others: grain, animals, service, silence. Leadership meant managing these debts. A mistake could cost lives during a bad harvest. A harsh demand could cause families to vanish into the hills. Cyrus learned that power was fragile. He watched how Median authority depended on cooperation from local leaders. He observed how orders were negotiated, softened, delayed, or ignored when they threatened survival. This was not rebellion. It was adaptation. There is a later legend that describes Cyrus as a child marked for death, spared by chance, and raised in secret. Whether this story reflects reality matters less than why it existed. People later wanted to explain his rise as destiny. But nothing about Cyrus's early career suggests inevitability. His strength was not charisma alone. It was patience. When Cyrus eventually challenged Median authority, he did not do so with spectacle. There was no dramatic declaration. Instead, he gathered support quietly. Persian leaders already trusted him. Median officials did not see him as a threat at first. He did not attack institutions, he absorbed them. If you were a soldier during this transition, you might not even realize which side you were on at first. Command structures stayed familiar. Supply lines remained unchanged. Rituals continued. Cyrus did not erase the system, he redirected it. This was his first lesson in conquest. People resist disruption more than they resist new rulers. Cyrus did not present himself as a destroyer. He framed himself as a stabilizer. This mattered deeply in a region exhausted by collapse and uncertainty. Once the Medes were absorbed rather than annihilated, Cyrus inherited something valuable, an existing framework of rule. He did not dismantle Median governance. He kept administrators in place. He respected local hierarchies. Loyalty was rewarded with continuity, not replacement. You begin to see a pattern. Cyrus did not rush. He allowed time to do work that force usually did. Rumors of fairness spread faster than fear. Cities heard stories before they saw soldiers. These stories changed calculations. When Cyrus turned westward toward Lydia, a wealthy kingdom ruled by Croesus, the contrast in style was stark. Croesus expected war to follow familiar rhythms, alliances, decisive battles, displays of wealth and confidence. Cyrus did not play this game. Instead of immediate confrontation, Cyrus waited. He watched alliances fracture. He allowed opponents to misjudge him. When battle finally came, it was not swift annihilation. It was pressure applied steadily, supply lines tested, patience exhausted. Even after victory, Cyrus did not punish cities unnecessarily. Lydia's capital, Sardis, was not destroyed. Its people were not displaced. Their economic systems continued. For ordinary inhabitants, life changed less than expected. Taxes went to a new ruler. Laws remained mostly intact. This approach confused enemies and reassured subjects. You would not fear Cyrus in the way Assyrian kings were feared. But you would not dismiss him either. His power did not burn hot, it endured. Cyrus's most famous conquest, Babylon, followed the same logic. Babylon was ancient, proud, and deeply symbolic. It was also tired. Its rulers had alienated priests, disrupted traditions, and imposed heavy labor. Cyrus did not attack Babylon as an enemy of its people. He framed himself as their relief. When Babylon fell, there was no mass slaughter. Temples were respected. Captive populations were allowed to return home. This was not generosity in a modern sense. It was strategy rooted in understanding human exhaustion. If you lived in Babylon at the time, the most remarkable thing would be how little violence accompanied the transition. Life did not suddenly improve, but it stabilized. The familiar returned. Cyrus understood something rare. Conquest is not only about taking land, but about convincing people not to resist tomorrow. Fear can win battles. It cannot maintain systems. Throughout these campaigns, Cyrus avoided excess display. He did not flood the world with monuments to himself. His inscriptions were restrained. He spoke in the language of local gods and traditions, not universal domination. This made his rule flexible. Different regions saw different versions of Cyrus. To some, he was a liberator. To others, a lawful king. To many, he was simply distant authority that allowed daily life to continue. You should notice what is missing. There is no single moment where Cyrus appears invincible. There is no dramatic transformation of society. Change happened through continuity. For soldiers, this meant long marches, long waits, and delayed rewards. For administrators, it meant learning to serve a new ruler without losing status. For farmers, it meant planting as usual and paying taxes to a different name. Cyrus's empire did not grow fast because it did not need to. It grew because it absorbed systems rather than replacing them. Each conquest strengthened the next by reducing resistance. By the end of his life, Cyrus ruled an empire larger than anyone on the plateau had imagined possible. Yet the world did not feel overturned. That was his achievement. He died not in a palace, but during a campaign, still moving, still managing instability at the edges. His death did not collapse the empire immediately, which is perhaps the strongest proof of his method. The system outlived the man. And yet, something fragile remained beneath this success. Cyrus's approach depended on his personal judgment, his ability to know when to wait and when to act. Systems built on restraint are harder to maintain without restraint. Holding what was taken circa 559 to 530 BCE. After the conquests, nothing ended. That is the detail most people miss. Victory did not close a chapter, it opened a long stretch of maintenance. For you, living somewhere inside this growing empire, the days after conquest felt strangely familiar. Fields still needed tending. Accounts still needed balancing. Disputes still needed settling. The banners had changed, but routine had not. This was deliberate. Cyrus the Great did not govern as if conquest were an event to be celebrated. He governed as if it were a problem to be managed. Each new region added weight to the system. Every city brought new customs, calendars, gods, and grievances. Speed had won territory. Slowness would have to keep it. You would notice first how little Cyrus interfered. Local elites stayed in place. Priests continued rituals. Laws were enforced by familiar faces. Authority flowed downward through existing channels. If you were a local official, you did not have to learn a new way of life, only a new loyalty. This reduced resistance quietly. People resist humiliation more than rule. Cyrus avoided humiliating anyone who mattered. Administration under Cyrus was not yet the satrapy system it would become later. It was looser, more personal. He relied on trusted individuals rather than fixed offices. This made governance flexible but fragile. Orders were clear, but oversight depended on character rather than procedure. You can imagine the constant movement. Messengers riding long distances, reports arriving late, decisions made with incomplete information. Cyrus accepted this uncertainty. He had grown up with it. Precision was less important than adaptability. Taxes were collected, but cautiously. Overburdening a region risked revolt or depopulation. Tribute was assessed based on local capacity, not imperial ambition. Grain where grain was abundant. Silver where trade was strong. Livestock where land allowed herding. Uniformity was avoided. This created an empire that felt uneven. Some regions contributed more. Others contributed differently. There was no single standard of obligation yet, only a general expectation of loyalty and contribution. Military presence was restrained. Garrisons existed, but they were not overwhelming. Soldiers were stationed to observe, not terrorize. This mattered. Occupation that feels temporary encourages patience among the ruled. Cyrus also understood symbolism. He did not impose Persian gods or rituals. Instead, he aligned himself with local traditions. In Babylon, he presented himself as chosen by Mordech. Elsewhere, he respected temples and restored offerings. This was not religious tolerance as ideology, it was political realism. If belief keeps people orderly, do not disrupt belief. For ordinary people, this translated into stability. You paid taxes, but your gods were untouched. You obeyed new rulers, but your calendar remained familiar. Change stayed abstract. Yet beneath this calm surface, the empire was learning itself. Boundaries were vague. Authority overlapped. Communication lagged. Cyrus had built something wide, not yet deep. Problems emerged at the edges. Nomadic groups resisted integration. Distant provinces tested limits. Local leaders sometimes exploited the ambiguity to increase their own power. Cyrus responded selectively. He did not rush to suppress every challenge. Some tensions were allowed to burn out. This selective response required judgment. Act too often, and authority looks nervous. Act too rarely, and it looks weak. Cyrus balanced this by personal presence. He traveled constantly. His visibility substituted for bureaucracy. But travel has limits. As the empire expanded, Cyrus could no longer be everywhere. Decisions increasingly relied on intermediaries. Loyalty now depended on trust in his system rather than in him personally. This was the quiet beginning of a problem that would outlive him. There was also the matter of succession. Cyrus did not establish a clear, uncontested process for transferring power. He may have assumed continuity would follow character. History would prove otherwise. Toward the end of his life, Cyrus returned to the edges, campaigning not for glory, but to contain instability. These were not triumphant wars. They were difficult, grinding efforts to keep borders quiet. When Cyrus died, far from the imperial center, the reaction was telling. There was grief, but not panic. The empire did not collapse. Administration continued. Taxes were collected. Armies remained loyal. This suggested strength, but also dependency. The system worked because habits had formed. But habits can erode. You, living under this empire, might not notice the danger yet. Life still felt stable. The roads still worked. Trade still moved. Authority still seemed distant but predictable. Yet the empire now faced a new test. Could a system built on restraint survive leaders tempted by excess, speed, or certainty? That question did not arrive all at once. It would unfold slowly, through policy decisions, court politics, and small changes that felt harmless at first. Movement without speed circa 530 to 500 BCE. After Cyrus, the empire did not announce its next step. It adjusted. If you were living anywhere within its borders, you would not hear speeches about reform. You would notice something subtler, movement becoming more reliable. Empires are not held together by walls. They are held together by repetition. Orders must travel. Information must return. Goods must move without drawing attention to themselves. What the Persian Empire needed now was not more land, but coherence. At first, nothing looked new. Paths had always existed. Traders had walked them for generations. Soldiers had marched them when required. But paths remembered by feet are unreliable. They vanish in floods, shift with seasons, depend on memory. An empire that stretches across mountains, rivers, and deserts cannot depend on memory alone. So the Persians did something deliberately unexciting. They formalized what already existed. You would see workers clearing routes rather than carving new ones. Stones placed at intervals. Rest points established near water. Nothing dramatic. No triumphal arches. No grand paving at first. Just consistency. This is where patience enters the story. If you were tasked with maintaining one of these roads, your work would not make you famous. You would clear debris after storms. Repair erosion. Replace markers. The goal was not speed, but predictability. A messenger should arrive not quickly, but eventually, and safely. The empire's leadership understood something learned from decades of watching others fail. Speed impresses, but reliability governs. Messages now traveled in stages. Riders did not exhaust themselves riding endlessly. They rode to the next post, handed off the message, and returned. This reduced error. It reduced deaths. It allowed information to flow continuously rather than in bursts. You might live near one of these relay posts. To you, it would feel like a quiet intrusion. Horses arriving at odd hours. Riders sleeping briefly, eating, leaving again. They did not ask questions. They did not linger. They carried sealed messages you would never read. These posts became anchors of imperial presence. Not forts. Not courts. Just points of continuity. What mattered was not what the message said, but that it arrived. Over time, these routes connected regions that had never felt adjacent. A decision made far away now affected your life sooner. Taxes were adjusted more evenly. Military movements became less surprising. Rs were replaced by confirmations. This changed behavior. Local leaders knew their actions could be reported. Not immediately, but inevitably. This discouraged impulsive rebellion. It encouraged negotiation. Time itself became a tool of governance. The road system did something else quietly. It flattened extremes. Distant provinces felt less distant. Central authority felt less abstract. You might never see a king, but you could imagine his reach more clearly. Alongside roads came measurement. Distances were counted. Travel time was estimated. Supply needs were calculated. This was not yet modern bureaucracy, but it was systematic thinking applied to movement. If you were a soldier, this changed your experience. Campaigns involved less chaos. Supplies arrived more often. Marches were planned with rest in mind. This reduced mutiny and desertion. An army that eats regularly obeys more consistently. If you were a trader, roads reduced risk. Banditry declined where traffic was predictable. Markets stabilized. Prices fluctuated less wildly. Commerce became boring, and boring commerce sustains empires. None of this required charisma. It required attention. The Persians did not invent roads. What they did was respect the labor of maintenance. Most empires build and forget. The Persian system invested in upkeep. Patience again. The road was not just physical. It was administrative. Records began to move with the same discipline. Orders were copied. Responses archived. Memory was externalized. This allowed continuity even when individuals changed. You could now be ruled by someone you had never met, and still experience consistency. This is one of the quiet transformations of empire. Authority becomes impersonal. At the same time, the Persians avoided over-standardization. Roads connected regions, but did not erase differences. Languages varied. Customs persisted. The road did not carry culture outward aggressively. It carried instructions inward efficiently. This mattered. Cultural uniformity invites resistance. Administrative uniformity invites compliance. Over time, the existence of these routes changed how people imagined space. The empire felt navigable. Borders felt less like edges and more like thresholds. Movement no longer implied exile. But there was a cost. Reliance on roads created dependency. Disrupt the route, and authority falters. Weather, rebellion, neglect, all could break the chain. Maintenance became a constant obligation. The empire accepted this burden. You would not praise a road. You would only notice its absence. By the end of this period, the Persian Empire had not become more glamorous. It had become more functional. And function is what allows scale. When patience became policy circa 522 to 500 BCE. After the roads began to settle into routine, something else happened, not suddenly, but decisively. The empire stopped improvising and started organizing itself on purpose. This shift is easy to miss because it did not change daily life right away. But it changed how decisions were made, and that mattered more in the long run than any single reform. The turning point came with the rise of Darius I, where Cyrus had ruled through personal judgment and presence. Darius ruled through structure. He did not abandon patience, he institutionalized it. If you were living in the empire then, you would not hear grand announcements. What you would notice instead were clearer expectations. Responsibilities became defined. Authority was divided and labeled. The empire began to explain itself to itself. Roads were now part of a larger logic. They were no longer just routes for messengers, they became arteries connecting administrative units. Each road linked districts to provincial centers, and provincial centers to the royal court. Information flowed in both directions, not quickly, but consistently. Darius understood that speed was not the goal. Control was. The relay posts became standardized. Distances between them were calculated more carefully. Horses were maintained at imperial expense. Schedules emerged, not written timetables, but expectations of arrival. A message delayed too long raised questions. Reliability became measurable. You might live near one of these posts and notice the difference. The riders were better equipped. The supplies were more regular. The disruptions were fewer. What once felt temporary now felt permanent. Alongside this, the empire was divided into satrapies, administrative regions governed by satraps. This was not centralization in the modern sense. Power was deliberately split. A satrap collected taxes. A military commander oversaw troops. A royal secretary handled records. No single person controlled everything. This was patience turned into design. If one official grew ambitious, others constrained him. If one failed, the system absorbed the failure. Rebellion became harder to organize quietly because authority was no longer concentrated. For you, this meant predictability. Taxes were assessed more consistently. Disputes followed clearer procedures. Appeals could travel upward along the same roads that carried orders downward. The roads now carried more than messages. They carried expectations. Measurement expanded. Distances were standardized. Weights and measures became more uniform. Coinage was introduced in a controlled way, not to replace local systems entirely, but to facilitate imperial transactions. This reduced friction between regions without erasing local practice. Trade benefited indirectly. Merchants trusted the routes because the state depended on them too. Banditry became an attack not just on travelers, but on imperial order. Suppression followed not out of moral outrage, but administrative necessity. Time itself became regulated. Travel durations were estimated. Seasonal delays were anticipated. The empire began to think in terms of cycles rather than reactions. This is what patience looks like when scaled. But this order required constant attention. Roads erode. Posts decay. Officials become complacent. Darius invested heavily in inspection. Reports were cross-checked. Officials were rotated. Loyalty was monitored quietly. You might never see an inspector, but you would feel their presence indirectly. A local official suddenly cautious. A delayed tax corrected. A complaint taken seriously where before it would have been ignored. This system did not eliminate injustice. It redistributed it more evenly. There was also resistance, not dramatic, but persistent. Some regions resented assessment. Others exploited loopholes. The empire responded selectively. Not every infraction was punished. Not every delay was corrected immediately. Overreaction would have undermined trust. Again, patience. Yet this very patience introduced a new tension. Order created expectations. Expectations created disappointment when unmet. People began to compare regions, burdens, privileges. Awareness spread along the roads just as authority did. The empire was becoming legible, to itself and to those it ruled. This legibility made governance possible at scale. It also made discontent easier to articulate. Grievances now had pathways. By the end of this phase, the Persian Empire was no longer held together primarily by personality. It was held together by systems that rewarded consistency over brilliance. You lived in a world where power moved steadily, not suddenly. Where change arrived through procedure, not proclamation. Power that sat still circa 520 to 490 BCE. You do not see power most days. That is how it works best. If you lived somewhere inside the Persian Empire at this time, far from royal courts, far from battles, you would experience authority not as spectacle but as paperwork. Orders arrived quietly. Taxes were assessed methodically. Disputes were recorded, reviewed, and resolved without ceremony. No one announced that you were being governed. You simply were. This was the satrap's world. A satrap was not a king. He did not wear a crown. He did not claim divine favor. His authority was wide, but deliberately incomplete. That incompleteness was the point. He governed a region, not a people's identity. If you imagined the satrap's office, it would not impress you. A desk, scrolls, seals, scribes moving in and out, messengers arriving tired, leaving quickly. Decisions made slowly, often after consultation. Nothing dramatic. And yet, from this desk, an empire functioned. The satrap's primary task was balance. He collected taxes, but did not command troops alone. He oversaw justice, but did not define law independently. He represented the king, but was never allowed to become the king in miniature. This separation was intentional. The Persian system assumed that unchecked power decays. So power was divided, watched, and documented. If you were a satrap, you spent more time listening than commanding. Local leaders brought disputes. Merchants complained about tolls. Farmers argued assessments after bad harvests. Priests defended exemptions. None of these issues were urgent alone. Together, they formed the daily weight of rule. You learned quickly that overreaction caused resistance, while neglect caused disorder. Most decisions were compromises. Reduced taxes 1 year. Delayed collections another. Enforcement softened, then tightened. Governance was not linear, it adjusted constantly. You were judged not by expansion, but by stability. If rebellion broke out in your region, it reflected poorly on you. If revenue dropped sharply, questions were asked. If too many complaints reached the royal court, inspections followed. Your success was measured by absence of revolt, absence of crisis, absence of attention. The satrap did not invent laws. He applied existing ones. Persian law was not a single code imposed everywhere. It respected local legal traditions. Babylonian courts continued Babylonian practice. Egyptian courts followed Egyptian norms. The satrap ensured consistency of outcome, not uniformity of method. This made justice feel familiar to those governed. You argued cases in your own language, before judges who understood your customs. The empire remained distant. But distance did not mean neglect. Records were kept carefully. Cases were summarized. Revenues were logged. Decisions were archived. These records traveled along the roads you already know, moving upward for review, sideways for comparison, downward for enforcement. You might never read these records. But they shaped your life. If you were taxed unfairly, there was a path, long and uncertain, but real, to appeal. If an official abused power, documentation mattered. Evidence accumulated slowly, but it accumulated. This was new. Earlier empires punished cruelty loudly. The Persian system discouraged it quietly. The satrap's desk was also a place of translation. Languages overlapped. Orders arrived in one tongue and left in another. Meaning mattered more than wording. Precision was valued, but perfection was impossible. Errors occurred. Corrections followed. Time was built into the process. The satrap rarely traveled extensively. Movement was delegated. Inspectors, messengers, and subordinate officials carried authority outward. This kept the satrap visible enough to matter, but stationary enough to govern. Power that moves too much becomes unstable. Power that never moves becomes irrelevant. The satrap remained anchored. You might live your entire life without seeing him. But you would feel his presence indirectly, in the regularity of obligations, the predictability of outcomes, the steady rhythm of administration. This kind of governance does not inspire loyalty through emotion. It creates compliance through habit. Yet there was tension built into the system. The satrap was powerful enough to matter, but not powerful enough to secure himself. His loyalty had to be maintained. His ambition had to be contained. The empire assumed that people might fail. So it designed systems that absorbed failure without collapse. But systems require maintenance. Records must be reviewed. Officials must be rotated. Trust must be renewed. If oversight weakens, power begins to pool. You would not notice this immediately. Decline does not announce itself. So as the satrap sat at his desk, reading reports, sealing orders, adjusting numbers, the empire held together through routine rather than force. When oversight became routine circa 490 to 460 BCE. After the satrap's desk became the center of provincial life, governance settled into something close to habit. This was the empire at its most stable, and also at its most vulnerable. Stability invites routine, and routine invites assumption. For a while, everything worked. Reports moved steadily along the roads. Taxes arrived on time. Local courts handled disputes without escalation. Military commanders remained separate from civilian authority. The system absorbed minor failures without drawing attention. This was the Persian ideal in practice, order without spectacle. If you lived under this system, you might begin to forget that it was designed. Governance felt natural, almost invisible. That invisibility was dangerous. Satraps grew experienced. They learned the rhythms of their regions, when to press, when to wait, whom to trust, whom to ignore. Many were competent, even careful. They understood that their power depended on not appearing powerful. But competence breeds confidence. Some satraps began to test boundaries, not through rebellion, but through accumulation. They delayed reporting. They filtered complaints. They favored certain families consistently. None of this broke the law outright. It bent it. This is how systems strain, not through sudden collapse, but through quiet drift. Oversight still existed. Inspectors traveled. Audits were conducted. But oversight, like all human activity, depended on effort. Inspectors relied on records provided by the very people they were meant to observe. Distance softened scrutiny. Familiarity dulled suspicion. You would not see corruption in dramatic form. You would see it as inconvenience. Appeals that took longer. Taxes assessed just slightly higher than before. Officials who seemed untouchable. Nothing worth risking open resistance. The empire tolerated a degree of this. Total purity was never the goal. Function was. But the balance was delicate. At the same time, the empire was facing new pressures from outside. Wars with Greek city-states drew attention westward. Resources were diverted. Royal focus shifted. When attention moves, gaps appear. Some satraps filled those gaps responsibly. Others filled them personally. If you were a local leader, you learned to navigate these personalities. You adjusted loyalty based on who mattered most nearby. The king remained distant. The satrap was present. Practical allegiance followed proximity. This did not mean the empire was fragmenting. It meant it was human. Records continued to pile up. Scrolls accumulated. Decisions multiplied. The system grew heavier. Each additional layer of administration increased stability but reduced agility. Adjustments took longer. Responses lagged. The satrap's desk became more crowded. To manage this, delegation increased. Sub-officials gained authority. Scribes handled more decisions. The satrap approved rather than initiated. Power diffused downward. Diffused power is resilient, but harder to correct. You might now deal with officials several steps removed from the satrap. Their understanding of imperial intent was partial. Their loyalty was practical. They enforced rules because it was their role, not because they understood the larger system. This created consistency without insight. The empire still functioned, but it no longer reflected on itself as often. Procedure replaced judgment. Forms replaced conversation. Appeals became technical rather than moral. None of this felt like decline. It felt like maturity. And maturity carries risk. When problems arose, regional unrest, tax shortfalls, local resistance, the responses were procedural. Investigations were launched. Reports were written. Decisions were escalated. Time passed. Time had once been the empire's greatest strength. Now it became a delay. You could sense this as a subject. Issues no longer resolved quickly. Authority felt slower, heavier. Still predictable, but less responsive. Trust began to thin at the edges. The satrap, once a quiet stabilizer, now stood between center and periphery more firmly. He interpreted imperial will rather than transmitted it. His discretion increased, not officially, but practically. The system still relied on loyalty. But loyalty was no longer reinforced by constant attention from above. It relied on habit, reputation, and personal calculation. And habits, once formed, are difficult to reverse. The empire was not in crisis. It was something more subtle, comfortable. Comfort dulls vigilance. As you move through this period, you feel the weight of order pressing gently, almost soothingly, on daily life. Things still work. They just work a little slower, a little farther from their original intent. And so, as the satrap continues to sit at his desk, signing, sealing, approving, you are left with a quiet, uneasy thought. Counting without hunger circa 520 to 480 BCE. Empires do not survive on conquest alone. They survive on meals that arrive on time. If you lived anywhere inside the Persian Empire, your relationship with the state was not defined by banners or proclamations. It was defined by what you gave. Grain, animals, labor, silver. Taxes were not abstract. They were physical. You could feel their weight because you carried it yourself. The Persians understood something earlier empires often ignored: taxation that causes hunger destroys loyalty. So they built a system designed not to extract everything, but to extract enough, consistently. This was not generosity. It was calculation. Before Persian rule, taxation was often unpredictable. Conquerors demanded tribute as proof of dominance. Amounts changed arbitrarily. Failure meant punishment. Communities learned to hide surplus and underreport capacity. The result was instability disguised as obedience. The Persian system reversed this logic. Taxes were regular, assessed, and, most importantly, expected. Expectation reduces fear. Fear disrupts production. You would know roughly what was required of you each year. Grain after harvest. Livestock after seasonal counts. Silverware coinage circulated. Labor for roads, canals, or storehouses when demanded. It was burdensome, but legible. This legibility mattered. If you were a farmer, your first obligation was survival. The empire did not interfere with this priority. Assessments were based on capacity, not potential. A bad harvest reduced obligations. A drought was acknowledged. Officials who ignored reality were corrected, not out of compassion, but because empty fields yield nothing next year. Taxes in grain were common where transport was practical. Grain fed soldiers, officials, and cities. It filled storehouses strategically placed along roads and near garrisons. These stores smoothed shortages and stabilized prices. You might curse the tax, but you also relied on the reserve during lean years. Silver functioned differently. It was portable, divisible, and abstract. Silver moved value without carrying food. Regions with trade networks paid in metal rather than produce. This allowed redistribution across distance. Grain fed locally. Silver moved centrally. You begin to see the logic. The empire did not insist on uniform payment. It accepted diversity of contribution. What mattered was balance. Tax records were meticulous. Amounts were logged. Shortfalls noted. Surpluses recorded. These records moved upward, not for punishment, but for planning. How many soldiers could be supported next year? Where should reserves be shifted? Which regions were strained? The empire learned to read its own body. Officials collecting taxes were watched carefully. Abuse undermined the system faster than rebellion. Excessive extraction was punished, not publicly, but decisively. An official who caused unrest disrupted revenue flows. That was unforgivable. You might encounter tax collectors who were stern but restrained. They measured. They negotiated. They delayed when necessary. Their authority came from the expectation that tomorrow mattered as much as today. This is the boring part of empire, the part most histories skip. But this is where survival happens. The introduction of standardized coinage under Darius I refined this system further. Gold and silver coins did not replace local currencies entirely. They supplemented them. Imperial transactions used imperial standards. Local markets retained familiar forms. This avoided disruption. Money remained understandable. Coinage allowed wages to be paid regularly. Soldiers received predictable compensation. Labor could be hired rather than coerced. This reduced resentment and increased reliability. An army paid on time is quieter. But coinage also introduced distance. Payment in silver disconnected obligation from food. Some regions felt the burden more acutely. Silver had to be obtained through trade or extraction. Not all areas adapted equally. The empire monitored this unevenness. Adjustments followed. Again, patience. Taxation was also seasonal. Collection aligned with harvest cycles. Demands were not constant. This allowed households to plan. Planning is dignity. Dignity reduces resistance. You might complain, but you did not panic. Taxes funded more than armies. They maintained roads, paid scribes, supported inspectors, fed horses, maintained relay posts. These costs were invisible to most, but essential. Without them, authority would fragment. The empire avoided overaccumulation. Hoarded wealth destabilizes economies. Reserves were used. Circulation mattered. Wealth that moves reinforces loyalty. Wealth that sits invites suspicion. This was not perfect. Some regions were overburdened. Some officials exploited loopholes. Some communities suffered quietly. No system eliminates injustice. But the Persian system distributed strain deliberately. What you gave was not a gift. It was participation. Over time, this participation reshaped identity. You were not just subject to power. You were sustaining it. This created a subtle bond. The empire depended on you as much as you depended on its order. Yet this dependence carried risk. As systems grow, expectations harden. Once people become used to predictability, disruption feels sharper. A delayed collection, a sudden increase, an unacknowledged hardship, these break trust quickly. The empire's tax system worked because it listened. It required constant adjustment. It assumed that conditions changed. If that assumption failed, so would the system. So as grain filled storehouses and silver crossed long roads, the empire ate steadily, never feasting, never starving. Standing still for an empire circa 520 to 480 BCE. When you imagine ancient armies, you probably imagine motion, charging lines, clashing weapons, decisive battles. But if you were a soldier in the Persian Empire, most of your service would be spent waiting. Waiting was not a failure of action. It was the action. The Persian army was not designed for constant fighting. It was designed for endurance. Empires do not fall apart because they lose battles. They fall apart because they cannot hold space between battles. Persian soldiers existed to occupy that space quietly. If you were recruited, your life would change slowly. You were not immediately transformed into a professional warrior. You brought your own equipment at first, what you could afford, what your region traditionally used. Standardization came later. Identity remained local. You were Persian, Median, Babylonian, Egyptian, or something else entirely before you were imperial. This mattered. The army reflected the empire's diversity rather than suppressing it. You trained, but not constantly. Drill was periodic, not obsessive. Discipline came from routine rather than punishment. You learned formations, signals, and expectations, but you also returned home when not needed. This reduced resentment. Service was an obligation, not exile. Much of your time was spent in garrisons. These were not glamorous posts. Often placed near roads, storehouses, or administrative centers, they existed to reassure rather than intimidate. You watched traffic. You guarded supplies. You enforced presence. Presence mattered more than violence. If unrest began, your role was to be visible. Armor worn. Banners displayed. Camps established. The hope was that action would never be required. Most conflicts ended here. People reconsidered. Local leaders negotiated. Authority reasserted itself without bloodshed. This waiting required restraint. Soldiers trained to fight had to learn not to. That is harder than it sounds. The Persian command structure reinforced this restraint. Military leaders were deliberately separated from civil authority. A general did not govern provinces. A satrap did not command armies alone. Orders came from above, often slowly. This frustrated some soldiers. Glory was limited. Rewards were delayed. Advancement depended on loyalty more than bravery. But it kept the system stable. Supply defined everything. Armies move on food, and Persian armies moved carefully because food was counted carefully. Grain from taxes filled storehouses. Herds were allocated. Campaigns were planned around logistics, not ambition. You did not march until supply was assured. You did not advance faster than wagons could follow. This made Persian armies appear slow to enemies accustomed to dramatic strikes. But slowness preserved cohesion. When campaigns did occur, they were often anticlimactic. Long marches, delayed engagements, skirmishes rather than decisive battles, negotiations mid-campaign, withdrawals that looked like weakness but were strategic pauses. Waiting continued even in war. Soldiers were paid, sometimes in silver, sometimes in goods. Payment was regular, not extravagant. This created predictability. A soldier who expects payment tomorrow is less likely to loot today. Discipline followed economics. The army was also deeply integrated into the empire's administrative system. Soldiers guarded tax routes, protected inspectors, escorted officials. Military force backed bureaucracy but did not replace it. If you were stationed far from home, you might serve alongside people who spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, and ate different food. This was normal. Commands were simplified. Signals relied on practice, not speech. Cooperation was functional rather than emotional. This diversity required tolerance. Conflict within the ranks was discouraged not through ideology, but through necessity. Fighting each other undermined survival. Elite units existed, the Immortals most famously, but even they were not constantly engaged in battle. Their strength lay in continuity. Losses were replaced quietly. The unit endured as a concept rather than as individuals. This endurance reinforced the Empire's image. The army seemed permanent, tireless, always present. This perception deterred resistance more effectively than violence. Yet patience had limits. When Persian armies met opponents who valued speed and decisive engagement, particularly Greek city-states, the contrast became visible. Greek forces fought short campaigns with intense focus. Persian forces prepared for long presence. Neither approach was inherently superior. But misunderstanding each other led to conflict. From the Persian perspective, the Greeks appeared impulsive. From the Greek perspective, the Persians appeared indecisive. These judgments ignored context. The Persian army was not designed to conquer quickly. It was designed to remain. If you were a soldier facing such opponents, waiting became harder. Pressure built. Expectations shifted. Commanders had to balance restraint with response. Patience became a liability when misinterpreted as weakness. Still, most soldiers spent their lives far from famous battles. They guarded roads. They escorted caravans. They watched borders that never erupted. Their service blended into ordinary life. This was the quiet strength of the Persian military system. It did not exhaust itself. It did not glorify death. It did not demand constant sacrifice. But it also relied on discipline reinforced by trust, trust that waiting mattered, that restraint served a purpose, that the empire would endure. As tensions increased at the edges, and as opponents challenged this model more aggressively, soldiers were asked to wait under pressure, to hold position when action was tempting. Worship without uniformity circa 550 to 450 BCE. If you lived inside the Persian Empire, belief was not something the state tried to fix. No one arrived to correct your prayers. No official inspected your rituals. No decree told you which god was correct. This absence was not accidental. It was policy, though it did not look like one. Most empires before the Persians treated religion as a tool of dominance. Conquered people were expected to honor the gods of their rulers, or at least acknowledge them publicly. Religious change was a signal of submission. Resistance was framed as heresy as much as rebellion. The Persians did not follow this pattern. You would notice it first in what didn't happen. Temples were not closed. Priests were not replaced. Sacred calendars remained intact. Festivals continued. The empire did not try to simplify belief into a single system. This restraint came from experience, not ideology. Religion, the Persians understood, organizes daily life more deeply than law. It sets work rhythms, dietary habits, family structure, and moral boundaries. Disrupt it, and you disrupt everything. Stability requires continuity. So belief was left where it already lived. If you worshipped in a Babylonian temple, nothing changed except the name on official documents. If you followed Egyptian rites, the empire funded temple repairs rather than interfering. If you honored local gods tied to rivers, mountains, or ancestors, no one corrected you. The state asked only one thing: loyalty expressed through order, not belief. This created an unusual experience. You could be ruled by an empire that did not care what you believed, as long as belief did not interfere with taxation, law, or peace. Faith became private without being hidden. Even Persian religious practice was not imposed outward. Early Persian belief emphasized moral order, truthfulness, and right action, but these were expectations of behavior, not rituals enforced on others. There was no missionary impulse. Fire rituals existed, but they were not exported. Moral language appeared in royal inscriptions, but it did not translate into forced conversion. The empire governed actions, not souls. You might encounter Persian officials who believed deeply in their own moral framework. But they did not require you to share it. Your compliance was measured by deeds, not prayers. This had practical benefits. Priests became allies rather than enemies. Temples functioned as local stabilizers. Religious authorities helped calm populations during transition. When Cyrus entered Babylon, he did not challenge the priesthood, he relied on it. That pattern continued. Temples also served administrative roles. They stored grain, recorded transactions, preserved legal customs. By leaving them intact, the empire preserved existing infrastructure. Religious diversity also reduced collective resistance. When belief is enforced uniformly, opposition unifies easily. When belief is plural, opposition fragments. This was not cruelty, it was realism. You lived alongside neighbors who worshipped differently, and the empire did not rank those differences. This made religious identity less political. Disagreement existed, but it did not become a rallying point against the state. There were limits, of course. Practices that threatened order, human sacrifice, violent cult activity, refusal to recognize civil law, were restricted. Tolerance did not mean absence of boundaries. But those boundaries were drawn around behavior, not doctrine. This approach required confidence. A state unsure of itself enforces belief. A state secure in its systems allows variation. But confidence can shade into complacency. As generations passed, people grew accustomed to religious autonomy. Belief became something the empire simply ignored. This reduced tension, but also reduced engagement. The state did not build moral unity. It built functional peace. This worked as long as the system delivered stability. When it did not, belief could re-emerge as a political force, not because it had been suppressed, but because it had been left alone. For now, though, life continued quietly. You prayed as you always had. You observed festivals without interruption. You buried your dead according to custom. The empire passed over you, heavy but distant. And that distance felt safe. Authority without a throne circa 550 to 400 BCE. If you searched for power in the Persian Empire by looking only at thrones, battlefields, and proclamations, you would miss much of it. Some of the most enduring authority in the empire did not announce itself. It moved quietly through households, estates, storehouses, and correspondence. This was where many women lived and worked, not outside power, but beside it. You would not see most of these women named in inscriptions. Their actions rarely appeared in official histories. Yet the empire depended on them daily. Begin with the household, because that is where administration actually started. Large Persian households were not private spaces in the modern sense. They were economic units. Grain was stored, labor organized, textiles produced, and servants managed. Estates functioned like small institutions, and many of them were overseen by women. If you were a woman of status, royal, noble, or connected to administration, you might manage land, supervise workers, authorize rations, and negotiate contracts. Tablets from Persepolis record women receiving and distributing food, commanding labor groups, and traveling with official support. This was not symbolic activity. It was logistical. The empire ran on logistics. Women were not generals, but they fed generals. They did not issue decrees, but they ensured that estates met obligations. When supply chains failed, armies stalled. When storehouses were well managed, campaigns lasted longer. Much of this depended on work done away from public view. You might imagine these women as confined or passive. That would be misleading. Their authority was real, but it operated through continuity rather than command. They did not need visibility to be effective. Royal women occupied a particularly complex position. Queens, mothers, and daughters of kings held influence that was both personal and structural. They controlled wealth. They sponsored building projects. They intervened in succession disputes quietly. They arranged marriages that stabilized alliances. You would not see them addressing assemblies. You would see their effects in appointments, in preserved estates, in the survival of certain families through political change. This kind of power required discretion. Visibility invited danger. In a court where intrigue was constant, survival depended on restraint. Women learned to exercise influence indirectly, not because they lacked strength, but because the system rewarded subtlety. Even outside elite circles, women shaped imperial stability. In villages and towns, they controlled domestic economies. They managed food reserves. They transmitted cultural practices. They ensured continuity during male absence, whether through military service, trade, or administration. An empire where men were often away required women who could maintain order without drawing attention. Disorder at home weakened authority abroad. Religion also created space for female authority. Priestesses existed in some traditions. Ritual roles varied by region. The Persian state did not standardize these roles, so local practices persisted. Women participated where custom allowed, without interference. This tolerance mattered. Religious authority often overlapped with social influence. Where women held ritual roles, they held community trust. That trust stabilized regions more effectively than force. You might ask whether this was equality. It was not. Legal and political structures remained male-dominated. Women's authority was often informal, conditional, and vulnerable. But it was also persistent. What made this power effective was that it did not challenge the system openly. It supported it by keeping life functional. That function was rarely celebrated, but always necessary. Records occasionally reveal glimpses. A woman receiving rations equivalent to high officials. A woman directing a workforce. A woman traveling with imperial permission. These moments are brief, but they accumulate into a pattern. The empire did not depend on exceptional women alone. It depended on ordinary ones, women who maintained households, raised children accustomed to obedience, managed resources, and preserved custom. This was the slow work of continuity. You would not hear praise for this work. You would hear silence. Silence is often how effective systems acknowledge dependence. But silence also conceals strain. Women bore the cost of imperial patience. When taxes increased, they stretched food. When men were absent, they absorbed labor. When political uncertainty rose, they maintained routine. Their work smoothed disruption, making instability less visible. This smoothing had consequences. It delayed crisis. It also hid warning signs. Systems that rely on invisible labor often fail to notice when that labor is exhausted. As the empire expanded and administration thickened, demands increased. Estates grew larger. Households became more complex. Expectations hardened. The margin for error shrank. Women continued to adjust. They always had. But adjustment has limits. As you look at the Persian Empire through this quieter lens, you begin to see power not as a single structure, but as a layered process, some layers loud, others silent. Women occupied many of the silent layers, holding things together without acknowledgement. The quiet math of exchange circa 520 to 450 BCE. Empires are remembered for wars, but they are sustained by markets that open on time. If you lived under the Persian Empire, trade was not exciting. That was its strength. Most days, nothing remarkable happened. Goods arrived. Prices shifted slightly. Measures were checked. Disputes were settled. You went home with what you needed and little reason to talk about it later. This ordinariness was deliberate. Before Persian rule, markets were fragile things. War disrupted routes. Arbitrary taxation distorted prices. Inconsistent measures bred mistrust. Trade survived, but it was tense. Merchants carried risk as much as goods. The Persians reduced risk by making trade boring. You would notice it first in the measures. Weights became more consistent. Lengths were agreed upon locally and respected regionally. Not perfectly, never perfectly, but enough that transactions felt predictable. Predictability is confidence. Confidence increases volume. Markets were not centralized. The empire did not build grand commercial hubs to control exchange. It relied on existing marketplaces, village squares, city streets, temple precincts. Commerce remained local in form, even as it became imperial in reach. If you sold grain, you sold it as before. If you traded textiles, pottery, metalwork, or animals, your routine barely changed. What changed was what you could expect afterward. Fewer sudden tolls, fewer arbitrary seizures, more stable demand. The empire needed this stability for its own survival. Taxes assessed in silver assumed silver could be obtained. Grain levies assumed grain could move. Supply chains depended on merchants more than soldiers. So merchants were tolerated, even protected. This did not mean they were celebrated. Traders were still viewed with suspicion in many cultures. Profit made people uneasy. But the Persian state understood that trade filled gaps administration could not. It let markets function without glorifying them. Roads mattered here, but not as highways of luxury. They were arteries for necessity. Grain moved toward garrisons. Wool moved toward workshops. Metal moved toward armorers. These flows were slow, steady, and mostly invisible. You might be part of this system without thinking about it. You sell surplus barley. A merchant carries it 2 days' journey. It feeds soldiers you will never see. In return, silver circulates back toward your town. The empire breathes through you. Standardized coinage helped, but it did not dominate. Barter remained common. Credit existed informally, promises recorded, remembered, enforced socially. The state did not try to replace these systems. It layered itself on top of them. This restraint mattered. When states overreach into markets, they create scarcity. The Persian approach was to observe, adjust, and intervene only when flows threatened to break. Inspectors monitored weights and measures, but not obsessively. Disputes were settled locally first. Only persistent problems escalated. This preserved autonomy and reduced administrative load. Markets also served as information hubs. Prices signaled scarcity or abundance. Traders carried news faster than officials. The state listened quietly. Adjustments followed. If grain prices rose sharply in one region, assessments might be eased. If silver pooled excessively somewhere else, levies might increase. These changes were not announced. They were implemented. This made the system feel responsive without appearing reactive. You would not attribute this to imperial wisdom. You would say, this year was easier, or, that market is better now. Perception mattered more than explanation. Trade also reinforced cultural tolerance. Merchants crossed linguistic and religious boundaries daily. They learned what offended and what sold. The empire benefited from this quiet negotiation. Markets softened differences faster than policy ever could. But mundanity carries its own risk. As markets stabilized, expectations hardened. Traders invested more. Households relied on predictable exchange. Disruption now carried higher cost. When routes were blocked or measures ignored, frustration escalated quickly. The empire's success made it fragile in new ways. Small changes mattered more than before. A delayed caravan, a new toll, a corrupt official adjusting weights slightly. These things, once absorbed, now caused complaint. Systems that work well reduce tolerance for failure. Still, for decades, trade flowed. People bought and sold. Measures aligned. The empire ate, clothed, and paid itself through countless small exchanges no one bothered to record in heroic histories. This was not progress as spectacle. It was maintenance as policy. And as you stand in a market, listening to bargaining, watching scales balance, hearing coins ring softly, you might sense how much of empire depends on such moments. Many tongues, one administration circa 550 to 450 BCE. If you traveled across the Persian Empire, the first thing you would notice was not architecture or clothing. It would be sound. Languages changed quickly, sometimes within a few days' walk. Accents shifted, scripts altered, words for the same thing carried different weights. You could cross an imperial road and suddenly understand nothing that was being said around you. And yet, the empire functioned. This was not because people understood each other. It was because the state did not demand that they try. Earlier empires often treated language as a tool of control. To rule was to impose speech, official tongues, sacred scripts, administrative vocabulary. Learning the ruler's language became an act of submission. Misunderstanding became disobedience. The Persian Empire avoided this path. You would not be required to abandon your language to participate in public life. Court records, legal documents, tax assessments, these were produced in the languages people already used. Babylonian scribes wrote in Akkadian. Egyptian officials used Egyptian scripts. Aramaic spread widely as an administrative bridge, but it did not erase others. The empire spoke through languages, not over them. This approach came from necessity. No single language could realistically dominate such a vast territory without enormous cost. Teaching, enforcing, punishing, these consumed resources better spent elsewhere. The Persians chose comprehension over uniformity. If you were an official, you likely worked with translators daily. Orders arrived in one language, were interpreted into another, and then recorded locally. Precision mattered, but perfection was impossible. The system accepted this. Meaning was negotiated. This created a slower administrative rhythm. Messages took time. Clarifications followed. Errors were corrected gradually. But slowness reduced resistance. People obeyed instructions they understood, even if they arrived late. You might receive a decree weeks after it was written. But when it arrived, it spoke your language, literally and culturally. That mattered more than speed. Aramaic became the closest thing to a shared administrative language, but it functioned as a tool, not a symbol. It was used because it worked, because many already knew it, because it was flexible, because it traveled well. No one was asked to revere it. Local languages retained prestige. Religious texts stayed sacred. Legal traditions remained intact. The empire did not flatten speech into a single register of authority. This had quiet effects. People did not associate imperial power with linguistic domination. The state felt less intrusive. Orders felt contextual rather than foreign. Compliance followed familiarity. But multilingual governance required discipline. Records had to be cross-checked. Translators held influence. Misinterpretation could cause conflict. Ambiguity was inevitable. The empire accepted ambiguity as a cost of scale. You would see this in legal cases. A contract written in one language interpreted by a judge using another tradition. Outcomes depended on custom as much as wording. This frustrated those who wanted uniform justice. It reassured those who feared erasure. Language also shaped identity. You did not become Persian by learning Persian. You remained who you were. The empire did not try to replace identity, it layered authority on top of it. This layering reduced rebellion. People resist when asked to abandon themselves. They comply when allowed to remain intact. But it also limited cohesion. Without a shared language of power, collective identity remained thin. Loyalty was practical, not emotional. You obeyed because systems worked, not because you felt part of something larger. For decades, this was enough. Yet language also carries memory. Stories, grievances, hopes, these live in words. As long as languages remained separate, so did narratives. Discontent stayed local. Rumors traveled unevenly. This fragmentation was initially a strength. It prevented unified opposition. But it also meant the empire lacked a shared voice when it needed one. As pressure increased, through war, taxation, and administrative strain, differences in language shaped differences in experience. Some regions felt burdened sooner. Others understood imperial intent less clearly. Misalignment grew quietly. You might hear complaints in one tongue that never reached another. You might misunderstand an order not because it was unjust, but because it was translated imperfectly. Small gaps widened. Still, day to day, the system held. You spoke your language. The empire spoke back in it. Life continued without linguistic conquest. Lives that did not fit the categories circa 550 to 430 BCE. If you asked the Persian Empire to define who was free and who was not, it would hesitate. Not because it lacked power, but because the question itself did not fit neatly into its system. Freedom, in this empire, was not a single condition. Slavery was not a single institution. Between them stretched a wide, uneven space filled with obligations, protections, permissions, and exceptions. Most people lived somewhere in that space. You would feel this first in the language. There was no universal term that captured slave as a fixed, absolute identity across the empire. Status depended on context, on household, occupation, origin, and law. Someone unfree in one setting might act with autonomy in another. Someone technically free might live under constraints that felt heavier than bondage. The Persian state did not invent this ambiguity. It inherited it, and chose not to resolve it. Earlier empires often relied on mass enslavement after conquest. Populations were uprooted, forced into labor, erased from their lands. The Persians did not follow this pattern systematically. Conquest, as you have seen, aimed at continuity. That included labor systems. You would find enslaved people in the empire, certainly. They worked in households, on estates, in workshops, and on royal projects. But their presence did not define the economy. They were not the primary engine of production. Agriculture relied mostly on free households and dependent communities bound by tax, not chains. This distinction mattered. If you were enslaved in the Persian world, your experience varied widely. Some were war captives, absorbed into households. Others were born into dependency. Some worked alongside free laborers, received rations, married, raised children, and accumulated small property. Others faced harsher conditions. There was no single narrative. Crucially, the law did not treat enslaved people as invisible. They appeared in records. They received rations. Their movements were tracked. This was not recognition of equality, it was recognition of function. You mattered because you worked. Legal status followed practicality. If an enslaved person ran away, the response was often recovery rather than punishment. Violence damaged labor value. Order mattered more than terror. You might also encounter people bound by debt. Debt bondage existed, but it was often temporary. Families fell into obligation during famine or crisis, working to repay what they owed. Release was expected, not exceptional. Permanent enslavement for debt was discouraged because it reduced long-term productivity. Again, calculation over cruelty. Temple laborers occupied another gray zone. They were attached to religious institutions, bound by ritual obligation rather than ownership. Their work supported temples that the empire relied on for stability. Interfering with this system risked unrest. So it remained largely untouched. Royal labor projects, roads, canals, storehouses, used a mix of free workers, dependent laborers, and state-supported personnel. Payment came in rations, not wages, for many. This did not always feel like freedom, but it was not chattel slavery either. If you worked on such a project, your life might be disrupted temporarily. You labored, you ate from state supplies, and then you returned home. Obligation was cyclical, not permanent. The empire preferred this model because it preserved households. Households were the foundation of taxation. Destroy them, and revenue collapses. Women and children often experienced these gray zones most sharply. A woman attached to a household might not be enslaved legally, but her choices were constrained. A child born into dependency inherited obligation, even if not ownership. Status was sticky. Yet movement between categories was possible. Records show individuals receiving release, reassignment, or improved rations. Status could change through service, marriage, or favor. This flexibility reduced desperation. But flexibility also concealed injustice. Because categories were blurred, abuse was easier to hide. Officials could exploit labor while claiming legality. Households could impose harsh conditions without violating formal law. Appeals existed, but they were slow and uncertain. Distance softened accountability. The empire accepted this risk. Uniform justice would have required uniform categories, and uniform categories would have required uniform enforcement. That would have shattered local systems the empire depended on. So ambiguity remained. Freedom, too, was conditional. Free communities owed labor, tax, and obedience. Refusal brought punishment. Freedom meant belonging to a system that demanded participation. You were free to live as long as you sustained order. This reframes the idea entirely. Freedom was not absence of obligation. It was obligation without ownership. If you were free, you still labored for the empire, through taxes, service, or compliance. If you were enslaved, you labored more directly, but sometimes with clearer expectations. Both lived within the same administrative logic. The Persian state did not moralize these distinctions. It managed them. This management extended to policy. The empire avoided large-scale forced relocations. It discouraged enslavement that disrupted local production. It tolerated local practices as long as order held. That tolerance was not kindness. It was recognition that human systems are messy, and forcing clarity where none exists creates resistance. Yet messiness accumulates. As generations passed, obligations hardened into traditions. Temporary measures became permanent. Gray zones became traps. What had once been flexible became customary, and custom is harder to challenge than law. You would not notice this change immediately. You would notice it in stories. It used to be different. My father had more options. This obligation never used to last so long. These are signs of systems aging. Still, the empire endured, fed by labor that did not fit clean categories. People worked. Households functioned. Projects were completed. The system absorbed discomfort quietly. But quiet absorption has limits. As pressures increased, from war, from taxation, from administrative weight, those living in the gray zones felt strain first. They had the least room to adapt, the fewest protections to rely on. Stillness at the center circa 520 to 450 BCE. If you stood at the center of the Persian Empire, you would not hear urgency. You would hear formality. The royal court was not a place of hurried decisions or constant command. It was a place designed to slow things down. This was intentional. In an empire that stretched across climates, languages, and customs, speed at the center often meant chaos at the edges. So the court chose ceremony. You would notice it immediately in how access worked. No one simply arrived before the king. Movement followed layers, guards, officials, scribes, intermediaries. Each step filtered emotion out of information. Anger cooled. Panic softened. What finally reached the throne was rarely raw. This filtering was policy disguised as etiquette. If you were a provincial official, your report would be written carefully, translated, copied, reviewed, summarized, and only then presented. Days or weeks passed. By the time the king heard of a problem, it was no longer urgent, it was manageable. This made the court seem detached. That detachment was its strength. The king, often Darius I, was surrounded by ritual. Dress codes, audience protocols, seating arrangements, these were not vanity. They created predictability. Everyone knew their place. No one improvised. Improvisation causes instability. Ceremony replaced argument. You did not debate policy openly. You performed loyalty. Requests were framed as deference. Disagreement was expressed indirectly or not at all. This limited confrontation at the center, pushing negotiation outward into administration. Decisions emerged slowly, often after repetition. The same issue might be raised several times, by different officials, in different forms. Only when patterns appeared did action follow. This reduced overreaction. From the outside, this looked like inaction. From inside the system, it felt like caution. The court also functioned as a symbol rather than an engine. It did not manage details. It confirmed legitimacy. By appearing stable, distant, and unchanging, it reassured provinces that authority endured beyond individual crises. This mattered. Empires fall when the center appears nervous. Court life followed strict routines. Audiences at set times. Ritual meals. Seasonal ceremonies. These rhythms anchored time for the empire. While regions experienced droughts, unrest, or war, the court remained visually unchanged. Continuity was projected through repetition. You would not hear shouting. You would hear scripted phrases. Praise flowed upward. Gratitude flowed downward. Emotion was contained. Even punishment followed ceremony. Executions, when they occurred, were formal and rare. Mercy was also ritualized. Both reinforced the king's position as arbiter, not participant. But ceremony has a cost. Distance grew between the court and lived reality. Reports lost texture. Urgency dissolved. Problems that required swift adjustment sometimes waited too long. The court assumed that systems below would absorb shocks, as they usually did. This assumption worked until it didn't. As long as roads functioned, taxes arrived, and soldiers waited, the court's stillness felt wise. It prevented rash decisions. It preserved balance. But pressure accumulated quietly at the edges: administrative delays, regional resentment, military frustration. These did not disrupt ceremony. They bypassed it. The court did not ignore the empire. It observed it slowly. And so, seated among columns and ritual, surrounded by order that looked eternal, the center of power remained calm, almost serene. Resistance without songs circa 520 to 450 BCE. Most revolts do not look like revolts. That is the detail history often loses. If you lived under the Persian Empire, rebellion was rarely announced with banners or speeches. It did not usually begin with armies marching or cities burning. It began with delays. A tax shipment that arrived late. A report that never quite reached the road. A local official who interpreted an order too narrowly. Resistance arrived as inconvenience. These were not heroic acts. They were cautious ones. People understood the scale of the empire they lived inside. Open defiance invited response, and response was methodical. The Persian state did not panic. It observed. It counted. It waited. Those who resisted learned quickly that speed favored the center. So most resistance avoided speed. You would hear about a village that stopped cooperating fully. Not refusing, just slowing. A town that began enforcing local custom more strictly, ignoring imperial guidance when it conflicted. A satrap who tolerated noncompliance longer than he should have. These actions did not feel revolutionary. They felt local. This was intentional. Revolt that looks like routine is harder to isolate. But the empire had been designed to notice routine. Reports moved along roads. Patterns emerged. One delay meant nothing. Several meant something. When similar issues appeared across a region, the system began to focus. And still, the response was rarely immediate. The Persian approach to unrest was not suppression first. It was diagnosis. Was the problem economic, religious, administrative, personal? Was it widespread or contained? Could it be resolved by replacing an official, adjusting assessments, or reaffirming local privilege? Many revolts ended here, without anyone naming them as revolts at all. A tax reduced. A boundary clarified. A complaint acknowledged. The disturbance dissolved. No punishment followed. Memory faded. This is why so many revolts left no dramatic trace. They were absorbed. But not all resistance could be softened. Some regions pushed further, not because they sought independence, but because they misjudged the system. They assumed slowness meant weakness. They assumed distance meant neglect. They were wrong. When resistance hardened into refusal, when taxes stopped entirely, when officials were attacked, when roads were blocked, the empire responded, but still without drama. Military force arrived not as invasion, but as presence. Garrisons reinforced. Supply lines secured. Leaders isolated rather than confronted publicly. The goal was not destruction. It was exhaustion. You might live through such a response and barely notice it as war. Soldiers appeared. Markets continued. Life narrowed, but did not explode. Communication slowed further. Choices diminished. Eventually, leaders faced a decision: submit quietly or be removed quietly. Most chose the former. When punishment occurred, it was precise. Individuals were targeted, not populations. Exile replaced massacre. Replacement replaced ruin. The message was clear without being loud: resistance costs, but compliance restores normal life. This precision discouraged martyrdom. Martyrs inspire memory. Quiet removal inspires forgetting. Some revolts did escalate, most famously in the Greek cities of Asia Minor. These cases are remembered because they intersected with later narratives written elsewhere. But even these revolts were not constant uprisings. They were uneven, uncertain, and internally divided. Many participants were reluctant. Some cities joined briefly, then withdrew. Others negotiated early. The empire responded selectively, harsh in places, lenient in others. Uniform punishment would have unified opposition. Variation prevented it. You must understand this pattern. The Persian state did not seek to prove dominance repeatedly. It sought to restore routine. Rebellion disrupted routine. Restoration was victory. For ordinary people, revolts were risks, not causes. Participation endangered livelihoods. Waiting was safer than choosing sides too early. Most people waited. Waiting again. This waiting frustrated would-be leaders. They could not mobilize mass enthusiasm. Appeals to identity failed in an empire that allowed identity to persist without politics. Appeals to belief failed where belief was not enforced. Appeals to hardship failed where hardship was managed. Revolts failed quietly because the system left little to rally against. But this success had a consequence. Because revolts failed quietly, the empire learned less from them. Loud crises force reform. Quiet ones reassure. Each absorbed disturbance confirmed the belief that the system worked as designed. And so small warnings were treated as confirmations of strength rather than signs of strain. Officials grew confident in containment. The court remained calm. Procedures continued. Adjustments were minor. The empire mistook endurance for permanence. For those who resisted and failed, memory faded quickly. No songs were sung. No monuments raised. Their actions left only thin traces, administrative notes, missing names, altered appointments. History moved on. Yet quiet failure accumulates meaning over time. Each absorbed revolt slightly increased administrative load. Each compromise hardened expectations. Each removal narrowed trust. The system remained intact, but heavier. You would not feel this weight suddenly. You would feel it in slower responses. In fewer exceptions granted. In increased reliance on procedure. Resistance had not disappeared. It had learned patience too. And so, after decades of quiet failure, rebellion did not vanish, it waited. Watching power from a distance circa 520 to 480 BCE. If you lived in a Greek city-state during this period, the Persian Empire was not something you experienced directly. It was something you heard about. News arrived slowly, carried by merchants, sailors, mercenaries, and exiles. Stories changed with distance. By the time they reached you, they were already shaped by fear, pride, and misunderstanding. Persia was not a neighbor, it was a horizon. And horizons distort size. From Greece, the empire looked impossibly large. Lands you could not imagine stretched under one authority. Peoples with unfamiliar customs paid tribute to a distant king. Armies gathered without urgency and waited without explanation. This slowness was unsettling. It did not fit Greek expectations of power. Greek political life was intense and compressed. Decisions were debated publicly. War was seasonal and direct. Victory and defeat were immediate and personal. Persia operated on a different scale entirely, one that made Greek politics feel small and exposed. This contrast mattered. Greek city-states defined themselves by autonomy. Even internal disagreements were framed as struggles over who ruled locally. The idea of distant rule that did not argue with you, that did not persuade you, that simply expected compliance, felt alien. You might trade with Persian territories without trouble. Goods flowed. Coins circulated. Merchants reported fair treatment. But this calm was suspicious. Power that does not shout is harder to challenge. Persia appeared everywhere and nowhere. It did not colonize Greek land aggressively at first. It influenced through alliances, subsidies, and quiet pressure. Some cities cooperated willingly. Others resisted symbolically. Most watched. Greek perceptions were shaped by proximity to the empire's western edge. Ionian cities, closer to Persian administration, had direct experience. Mainland Greece did not. This created uneven understanding. Some Greeks saw Persia as tolerable rule. Others imagined it as inevitable domination. Fear grew not from what Persia did, but from what it might do. Greek storytellers filled gaps with drama. The Persian king became a figure of excess, rich beyond reason, commanding endless troops, ruling subjects who obeyed without voice. These stories simplified a complex system into something emotionally legible. Simplification breeds confidence. If the enemy is imagined as uniform, victory feels possible. From Persia's perspective, Greece was marginal. Greek lands were fragmented, poor in resources compared to the empire's heartlands, and politically unstable. They mattered strategically, not symbolically. Persia did not rush. This difference in urgency created tension. Greeks watched an empire that did not seem to notice them, and that neglect felt threatening. To be ignored by power is unsettling. Attention at least confirms relevance. When Persia did act, supporting tyrants, intervening after revolts, demanding symbolic submission. It felt sudden to the Greeks, even though it followed long deliberation. Slowness on one side looked like surprise on the other. This mismatch shaped misunderstanding. Greek resistance hardened into identity. Freedom became defined not just as self-rule but as not Persian. Cultural differences were sharpened. Habits became virtues. Alternatives became vices. Persia did not encourage this framing. It did not respond with propaganda. It did not try to explain itself. Explanation was unnecessary within the empire. Outside it, misunderstanding was tolerated. Tolerance has limits. As Greek cities argued among themselves, some urging accommodation, others defiance, the idea of Persia grew larger than reality. It became a test rather than a neighbor. A mirror for Greek anxieties about unity, discipline, and endurance. And Persia, still patient, still methodical, continued to watch from afar, aware of Greece, but not yet shaped by it. Inheriting a system, not a throne circa 486 to 480 BCE. There were no sudden reforms, no sweeping purges, no declarations that the empire would change course. Roads still functioned, taxes still arrived, satraps still governed, armies still waited. If you lived anywhere inside the Persian Empire, you might not feel the moment of succession at all. That was the inheritance Xerxes received, a system that worked without him. This was both his strength and his burden. Xerxes I did not inherit a fragile realm in need of rescue. He inherited an empire that expected continuity. That expectation is heavy. When systems run smoothly, deviation feels dangerous. Innovation feels reckless. Leadership becomes maintenance. You must imagine the court at this moment, calm, ceremonial, deliberate. Officials knew their roles. Procedures were established. Decisions followed precedent. The memory of Darius's order was still fresh. The empire did not want inspiration. It wanted reassurance. Xerxes was expected to be stability. Yet inheritance always comes with comparison. Cyrus was remembered as the founder. Darius as the organizer. Xerxes inherited their legacies without their freedom. He did not get to define the empire. He had to embody it. This shaped his rule from the beginning. He was surrounded by advisors who valued caution. They had lived through revolts, reforms, and consolidation. They trusted process. They distrusted impulse. Every decision passed through layers of review. This protected the empire, but it also isolated the king. If you were Xerxes, you would hear filtered information. Problems arrived softened. Urgency arrived delayed. Praise arrived amplified. This was not deception, it was protocol. Ceremony was designed to protect the center from noise. But noise is sometimes signal. Xerxes inherited unresolved pressures. Revolts in Egypt and Babylon reminded the court that order required attention. These were not existential threats, but they tested confidence. Responses were firm, controlled, and successful, but they reinforced a lesson. Authority had to be seen occasionally to be believed. Visibility matters after long stillness. Xerxes was also heir to an unfinished relationship with Greece. From the Persian perspective, this was a peripheral issue, one of several border concerns. From the Greek perspective, it was existential. This imbalance of importance would matter. Within the empire, expectations quietly shifted. A new king brings anticipation, even when continuity is desired. Satraps watched for signals. Military commanders waited for direction. Courtiers listened for tone. Leadership is read in nuance as much as in policy. Xerxes learned quickly that inaction could be interpreted as indecision. But action risked breaking the balance his predecessors had built. He was expected to act only when necessary, and necessity was defined by others. This is the paradox of inherited power. You rule, but within boundaries you did not choose. Ceremony intensified under Xerxes. Ritual affirmed legitimacy. Public displays reinforced continuity. The king appeared as the center of order, not its source. This reassured the empire, but it also placed emotional distance between ruler and ruled. Distance can feel like indifference. Xerxes was not impatient by nature. But he ruled at a moment when patience was being tested, from the edges, from advisors, from history itself. The empire had absorbed strain quietly for decades. Now questions surfaced about presence, projection, and response. Should the empire remain watchful and reactive? Or should it demonstrate its reach more visibly? You might think of Xerxes as powerful beyond measure. In reality, he was constrained, by precedent, by expectation, by the success of those who came before him. Failure would be judged harshly. Excess would be remembered. When things still worked circa 470 to 400 BCE. If you were living inside the Persian Empire during this period, the idea of decline would sound strange to you. Nothing obvious was breaking. Roads still carried messengers. Taxes still arrived. Satraps still governed. Armies still waited. Markets still opened. Rituals still repeated. From the inside, the empire felt intact. That was the problem. Decline did not arrive as disaster. It arrived as continuation. You would not point to a single year and say, "This is when it began." Instead, you would notice small adjustments becoming permanent. Temporary measures no longer reversed. Exceptions becoming rules. What had once been flexible now hardened. The empire was no longer expanding meaningfully, but it was not shrinking either. Borders held. Revolts were contained. Administration continued. This created the illusion of equilibrium. But equilibrium requires energy. Over time, the energy shifted from innovation to preservation. Officials became more cautious. Decisions were deferred more often. The cost of making a mistake felt higher than the cost of delay. This is a classic sign of systems aging, not failure, but risk aversion. You would feel this as a subject. Petitions took longer. Appeals climbed higher. Answers came back more formal, less tailored. The system still listened, but it listened through layers. Satraps grew more entrenched, not openly rebellious, but confident in their position. Distance from the center increased practical autonomy. Oversight continued, but familiarity softened it. Inspectors reviewed records that had been written with inspection in mind. This was not corruption in the dramatic sense. It was optimization for survival within the system. Military readiness changed too. Armies remained large, but enthusiasm waned. Soldiers still trained, but campaigns felt less purposeful. The empire fought fewer wars of necessity and more of maintenance, holding territory rather than shaping it. Waiting, once strategic, became habitual. The court remained ceremonial, but ceremony now did more than slow decision-making. It insulated the center from urgency. Problems arrived already processed. The king ruled a curated empire. This created confidence at the top, and quiet frustration below. Economically, the system still functioned, but margins narrowed. Trade disruptions had greater impact than before. Tax adjustments were harder to make without provoking resentment. People had grown used to predictability. Any deviation felt unfair. Tolerance for strain decreased as comfort increased. Culturally, the empire's diversity remained, but its cohesion weakened. Without a shared language of identity or purpose, loyalty stayed practical. People obeyed because it worked, not because they believed. When systems work, belief feels unnecessary. When they strain, belief matters. Externally, rivals adapted. Greek states learned how to fight Persian armies more effectively. Local powers tested boundaries. The empire responded, but always carefully, never recklessly, never decisively enough to reset the balance. This caution preserved order in the short term. It also allowed pressure to accumulate. You might notice conversations changing. Less confidence in the future. More nostalgia for earlier reigns. Comparisons to Cyrus and Darius grew more frequent. This is another sign of decline, when memory becomes a benchmark rather than inspiration. The empire did not fall apart because it was built to absorb stress. That design now worked against renewal. The same patience that had enabled growth now slowed adaptation. Decline here was not loss of territory. It was loss of momentum. You lived in an empire that still functioned, but no longer surprised itself. Procedures replaced judgment. Maintenance replaced ambition. Order replaced vision. A world that moved too fast circa 336 to 333 BCE. When Alexander entered the Persian world, it did not feel like the end of anything. At first, it felt like a disturbance, sharp, local, and temporary. From inside the Persian Empire, this mattered. The empire had absorbed disturbances for generations. You must understand the scale of misunderstanding here. To the Persians, Alexander was not destiny. He was a problem at the edge, one more campaign launched by a fragmented Greek world that had always been loud, impulsive, and short-lived. Greek threats had appeared before. They had been managed before. The system expected time. Alexander did not give it any. Alexander the Great did not arrive with patience. He arrived with momentum. His armies moved quickly, decisively, and without waiting for full certainty. This alone made him unusual. Persian strategy assumed opponents would pause, after victories, after losses, after negotiations. Alexander treated pauses as weaknesses. If you were a Persian satrap near the western frontier, your reports would arrive already outdated. By the time you described Alexander's position, he had moved. By the time you requested reinforcements, the situation had changed again. The Persian system was built to respond correctly, not immediately. Alexander fought battles as if time itself were a weapon. He forced decisions before procedures could engage. He attacked supply lines, not just armies. He struck commanders directly, bypassing layers of authority. From a Persian perspective, this behavior looked reckless. It ignored safeguards. It violated expectations. But it worked, because it exploited the very patience the empire relied on. The first major confrontations did not shatter Persian power. They exposed its rhythm. Persian forces gathered as they always had, carefully, with supply secured, command structured, and consultation complete. Alexander struck before these preparations matured. Victory came not from superior numbers, but from collapsing timelines. You would notice something new and unsettling: confusion at the edges. Not panic, confusion. Orders arrived too late. Garrisons waited for instructions that no longer applied. Satraps hesitated, unsure whether to act independently or follow procedure. Alexander's speed forced local decisions. Some officials resisted. Some surrendered. Some switched sides. Not out of betrayal, but out of pragmatism. The empire had taught them to value continuity. Alexander promised it, immediately. This was another shock. Alexander did not dismantle Persian systems where he conquered. He used them. He adopted local administrators. He respected local customs when it suited him. This blurred the moral clarity of resistance. If he had been purely destructive, opposition would have hardened. Instead, he appeared as an alternative center of authority, faster, closer, more decisive. The Persian court, distant and ceremonial, struggled to respond. Reports conflicted. Advisors debated. Time passed. The system did what it had always done: it processed. Alexander advanced while it processed. You might think the empire failed because it was weak. It was not. It failed because it was slow in a moment that punished slowness. Yet even now, collapse was not inevitable. The empire still had resources. It still had armies. It still had legitimacy. What it lacked was coordination under urgency. The Persians expected campaigns to be negotiated, seasonal, bounded. Alexander treated war as continuous motion. He did not pause to consolidate until consolidation followed him. From inside the empire, this felt unreal. Systems that had endured for centuries were being bypassed, not dismantled, but outrun. And that is the key distinction. Alexander did not defeat Persian order head-on. He stepped around it. Some regions experienced violence. Others barely noticed. This unevenness is important. It shows that the empire had not relied on constant coercion. Coercive systems collapse loudly. Administrative systems dissolve quietly. Over time, new rulers adapted Persian tools for their own use. Taxation methods, provincial divisions, record-keeping practices. The empire did not die, it dispersed. This dispersal carried its own loss. What disappeared was not infrastructure, but coordination. Roads still connected places, but no longer served a single purpose. Taxes were collected, but not redistributed as predictably. Armies existed, but without the same restraint. The quiet patience that once balanced everything faded. And with it, something subtle vanished. The expectation that power would wait. Alexander's successors ruled differently. Faster in decision, harsher in correction, more present in local affairs. Some regions prospered, others suffered. Stability became uneven. People adjusted again. They always had. But the Persian model, rule through distance, tolerance, and routine, did not fully return. It proved difficult to replicate without the long habits that had built it. What remained, then, was not nostalgia, but residue. Residue in roads still walked centuries later. Residue in administrative logic reused by later empires. Residue in the idea that difference could be governed without erasure. The Persian Empire did not leave behind monuments that demanded remembrance everywhere. It left behind systems that quietly shaped what came next. After the center was gone circa 330 to 300 BCE. When Persian power disappeared from a place, it did not leave behind silence. That is the mistake many histories make. They imagine collapse as absence, as if authority simply vanished and chaos rushed in. But if you lived in a former Persian province after Alexander's victories, what you experienced was continuity without direction. Things still worked. Roads still existed. Markets still opened. Taxes were still collected, though sometimes by new hands. Courts still heard disputes. Priests still tended temples. Farmers still planted. Soldiers still guarded storehouses, sometimes without knowing exactly for whom. The center was gone, but the habits remained. This was the empire's final achievement. The Persian system had trained people to live inside procedures rather than personalities. Authority had been distant even at its height. So when it withdrew, daily life did not immediately unravel. The world felt oddly familiar, just less certain. If you were a local official, you did what you had always done. You referenced old records. You followed established routines. You waited for instructions that never arrived, and then you adjusted quietly. Power had taught you how to operate without constant supervision. This created a strange interval. Alexander moved fast, but even he could not replace everything at once. In many regions, Persian administration continued under new oversight. Satrapies became provinces under Macedonian generals. Scribes kept writing in the same scripts. Taxes flowed along the same roads. Conquest replaced the top, not the structure. This meant that Persian order outlived Persian rule. You might still use Persian measures, still travel Persian roads, still rely on storehouses built generations earlier. The empire had embedded itself into the landscape. What disappeared first was not administration, it was confidence. People no longer knew which authority would endure. Loyalties became provisional. Compliance became cautious. The assumption that tomorrow would resemble today weakened. This uncertainty did not explode into rebellion everywhere. It produced hesitation. Investments slowed. Long-term planning declined. People became more conservative, not politically, but economically and socially. Why expand a vineyard if authority might change again? Religious life continued almost unchanged. The Persian policy of non-interference had ensured that belief systems were not tied to imperial legitimacy. Temples did not collapse with the state. Ritual calendars endured. This meant identity survived power loss intact. Language, too, remained. Administrative tongues shifted slowly. Aramaic persisted. Local languages held ground. Alexander did not impose Greek universally. Even Hellenization, where it occurred, layered itself onto existing practices. The Persian habit of tolerance made replacement easier, but also made memory blurrier. You might struggle to mark the exact moment when Persian rule ended in your town. No dramatic rupture announced it. No universal reform erased the past. Power faded unevenly.